Hey guys, tonight we're drifting back through the centuries to medieval Scotland, where you're about to discover that surviving a single day would make your worst Monday look like a spa retreat. You're standing on a mist-soaked Highland moor. The year is somewhere around 1297, and honestly, you probably won't survive this. The cold seeps through your rough woolen plaid like ice water. Your stomach gnaws with the kind of hunger that makes you understand why people ate bark soup. And somewhere in the distance, bagpipes wail not the romantic tourist kind, but the bone-chilling sound that means another clan is coming to steal your cattle and possibly remove your head. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment below telling me where you're listening from and what time it is in your corner of the world. Whether you're tucked in bed in Tokyo at 2 a.m. or avoiding work in Toronto at lunch, I love knowing we're all connected across time zones, just like those ancient clan networks that stretched across the Scottish Highlands. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're walking through a Scotland that Hollywood forgot to mention, the one where life expectancy hovers around 24 years, if you're lucky. Where a third of all children die before their 5th birthday. And where your greatest achievement might be dying with all your fingers still attached. The mist clings to everything like a cold, wet blanket that never dries. And you realize this isn't the Scotland of tartan shops and shortbread tins. This is the Scotland where clan warfare isn't a colorful tradition, but Tuesday afternoon. Where the Catholic Church can burn you for looking at herbs the wrong way. And where even the nobility sleep with their swords, because you never know when your cousin might decide he'd make a better lord. Your feet squelch through the boggy ground. Historians still argue whether medieval Scots had more words for mud than Eskimos have for snow as you approach a cluster of black houses. Those low stone dwellings where humans and livestock share warmth because survival trumps dignity every time. The smell hits you first. Peat smoke, unwashed bodies, and the peculiar medieval cocktail of hope and despair that no amount of modern sanitizer could fix. Inside one of these hovels, a family of 8 shares a space smaller than your modern bathroom, and they consider themselves fortunate because last week's raid by Clan MacDonald only took half their barley instead of all their lives. You notice the children first thin as fence posts, eyes too large and gaunt faces, already working from dawn to dusk at age 6 because childhood is a luxury Scotland can't afford. One quirky detail the history books rarely mention. These kids play a game called Raid the Campbell Cattle with stones and sticks, essentially training for the violent adulthood that awaits them if dysentery doesn't claim them first. The mainstream historical fact here is brutal infant mortality in medieval Scotland exceeded 50%, making every surviving child both a miracle and future clan warrior. The head of this household, let's call him Hamish, because every third male in medieval Scotland seems to be named Hamish, shows you his most prized possession, not gold or jewels, but a rusty iron pot that's been in his family for 3 generations. He tells you, in Gaelic, because English is for those soft lowlanders, about the time his grandfather used this very pot to brain a MacDonald raider. You nod appreciatively, while privately thinking that your microwave could take this guy in a fight. But then again, your microwave has never had to defend 6 children from a cattle raid at midnight. You follow Hamish outside where the perpetual Scottish drizzle has upgraded to what locals cheerfully call soft weather. Soft in the way a hammer is soft compared to an anvil. The clan system surrounds you like an invisible web, and you're beginning to understand that in medieval Scotland, your clan isn't just your family, it's your social security, health insurance, and military defense all rolled into one kilted package that smells faintly of sheep. The Campbell-MacDonald feud is already legendary by the time you arrive, a multi-generational murder spree that makes the Hatfields and McCoys look like a minor disagreement over a borrowed lawnmower. Historians still debate whether the 1297 ambush, where MacDonald slaughtered an entire Campbell wedding party, was justified revenge or just another Tuesday in the Highlands. But you're learning that in medieval Scotland, the distinction hardly matters. What matters is that young boys grow up memorizing not multiplication tables, but the names of enemies their grandfather's grandfather swore to destroy. You're invited well, commanded, really. Because declining a clan chief's invitation is like RSVPing no to your own funeral to witness a gathering at the local tower house. The chief, a man whose beard could house a family of ptarmigans, sits in his great hall dispensing what passes for justice in these parts. A crofter accuses his neighbor of stealing 3 chickens. The accused counters that they were payment for the time the accuser's son got drunk and vomited on his best plaid. The chief's solution: they'll settle it with a friendly bout of wrestling, where friendly means probably won't result in permanent maiming. The fascinating thing about Highland justice is how it operates entirely on reputation and honor rather than written law. One fringe historical detail that anthropologists love: Highland courts sometimes used trial by ordeal, including making accused witches hold hot iron bars. Because apparently, medieval Scots believed guilt made your hands burn faster. A scientific theory right up there with "the earth is definitely flat" and "bathing causes plague." You watch as 2 grown men roll around in mud that's 40% cow dung, 40% rain, and 20% the tears of their ancestors, all over 3 chickens that probably died of old age anyway. The crowd cheers like it's the World Cup finals, placing bets with whatever they have: a handful of oats here, a slightly bent dirk there. Someone offers to wager his daughter's hand in marriage, which seems excessive until you remember that in medieval Scotland, daughters are basically currency with opinions. The chief declares the match a draw when both men are too exhausted to continue, ordering them to share the chickens and shake hands. They do, grudgingly, but you can see in their eyes that this will be revisited in about 3 generations when their great-grandchildren mysteriously find each other's cattle in their fields. It's the Highland way: forgive never, forget nothing, and maybe stab someone about it in 50 years. After the trial, you're treated to what the chief generously calls a feast, but what your modern palate would recognize as desperation garnished with hope. The main course is a gray meat that could be mutton, could be venison, could be last week's losing wrestler you don't ask. It's accompanied by oatcakes so hard they could be used as roofing material, and ale that tastes like someone fermented gym socks, but provides the only reliable source of calories and brief escape from reality most Scots will ever know. Ots will. You spend the night in the tower house, though sleep is a generous term for what happens when you're lying on a straw pallet that's home to more livestock than a petting zoo. Every time you drift off, something scurries across your feet. Could be rats, could be the chief's children. In medieval Scotland, the difference is mainly academic. The wind howls through gaps in the stone walls, like the voices of all the clansmen who died defending this pile of rocks. And you're starting to understand why Scots developed whiskey. It wasn't for pleasure, it was for survival. Morning comes whether you've slept or not, announced by a rooster that sounds like it's gargling gravel and the acrid smell of peat fires being stoked. You stumble outside to find the entire household already at work, because in medieval Scotland, sunrise is considered sleeping in. Women are milking cows that look like they're held together by spite and habit, while men sharpen weapons with the casual efficiency of people who use swords more often than forks. Today you're joining a cattle raid, because apparently, that's what passes for economic policy in the Highlands. The chief's son, a strapping lad of 16 who's already killed 3 men and fathered 2 children, not necessarily in that order, explains the complex moral mathematics of cattle reaving. See, the MacLeods stole 20 cattle from the Campbells last spring, but the Campbells had stolen 15 from the MacDonalds the previous winter, who had taken them from the MacLeods in autumn. So really, this raid is just balancing the books with interest. The raiding party consists of 30 men whose ages range from barely stopped nursing to should definitely be dead by now. They're armed with claymores, dirks, axes, and an optimism that borders on delusional. One peculiar historical detail: Highland raiders often wore their plaids soaking wet before battle, because the weight supposedly provided extra protection against sword cuts, essentially armor made of pneumonia. You trudge through glen and over ben, that's valley and mountain, for those of you who don't speak scenic. Your feet squelching in boots that are more suggestion than footwear. The rain has evolved from soft to aggressive negotiation with gravity, and you're beginning to suspect that Scottish weather is actually sentient and holds a personal grudge against human comfort. Historians still argue whether the constant rain made the Scots tough or just very, very irritable, though these aren't mutually exclusive options. The senior warriors regale you with tales of past raids, each story more improbable than the last. There's the time Angus Moore held off 20 MacDonalds with nothing but a butter churn and righteous fury. The night when Black Duncan stole 50 cattle so quietly that their owners didn't notice for 3 days. The legendary raid where both sides got so drunk on captured whiskey that they forgot why they were fighting and ended up having a sealive instead. You're starting to notice a pattern. Scottish history is 50% violence, 50% alcohol, and 100% refusing to let facts get in the way of a good story. The actual raid happens at dawn because apparently Highland warriors share scheduling preferences with garbage collectors and sadists. You creep through the pre-dawn mist toward a MacDonald settlement, your heart pounding so loud you're convinced it's going to give away your position. The plan, such as it is, involves half the party driving off cattle, while the other half discourages pursuit, where discourages is a euphemism for introduces steel to internal organs. Everything goes sideways immediately, because this is Scotland, and plans are for people who don't believe in fate, fairies, or the fundamental perversity of the universe. The MacDonalds were expecting you. Turns out one of your party's cousins is married to a MacDonald, who mentioned something at dinner. And Highland intelligence networks make modern social media look slow. What follows is less stealthy cattle acquisition, and more very loud argument with weapons. You find yourself in your first real sword fight, and it's nothing like the movies, unless Hollywood started including the immediate need to vomit from terror, and the discovery that swords are remarkably heavy when someone's trying to kill you with one. Your opponent is a MacDonald who looks like he was carved from granite and raised on a diet of pure rage. The mainstream historical fact is that Highland warriors were among Europe's most feared fighters. The fringe detail: They sometimes fought naked, which seems tactically unsound until you realize the psychological impact of a screaming naked man running at you with a claymore. By some miracle involving luck, mud, and your opponent tripping over a sheep, you survived the encounter. The raid nets 12 cattle, 3 sheep, and a MacDonald who was too drunk to run away, and now insists he's always been a Campbell anyway. Casualties are surprisingly light, 2 wounded. 1 missing, he'll turn up next week married to a MacDonald girl, and everyone's dignity, which was lost somewhere between the war cries and the tactical retreat that definitely wasn't running away in panic. The journey home takes twice as long because cattle have strong opinions about being stolen and express them through stubbornness. You're assigned to the rear guard, watching for MacDonald pursuit while trying to convince a particularly obtuse cow that, yes, she's a Campbell cow now and needs to accept this career change. The rain continues because of course it does, and you're so wet that you've evolved gills. Back at Campbell territory, the successful raiders are greeted like conquering heroes, which in this economy they basically are. The cattle are divided according to a complex formula involving participation, bravery, and who needs milk most desperately. You receive a share despite spending most of the raid questioning your life choices and discovering new ways to be terrified. The chief's son slaps you on the back hard enough to relocate your spine and declares you're now a true Highland warrior, which apparently means someone who survived doing something incredibly stupid. That evening's celebration makes the previous feast look like haute cuisine. The highlight is black pudding, which you learn is made from blood, oats, and whatever else was lying around when they ran out of actual food. It tastes like iron and regret, but provides essential nutrients like not starving to death, which is the most important nutrient in medieval Scotland. The women serve while simultaneously judging everyone's table manners, which is rich considering you're eating with dirks in a room where the dogs outnumber the plates. The entertainment consists of a bard who sings the raid's praises in Gaelic, already transforming your terrified stumbling into heroic combat prowess. According to his version, you personally fought off 6 MacDonalds while reciting poetry and juggling claymores. You try to correct him, but learn that in Highland culture, accuracy is less important than a good narrative arc. Historians still debate whether Highland oral history is unreliable or whether medieval Scots actually did accomplish impossible feats through sheer bloody-mindedness. An old woman corners you by the fire, her face a topographical map of every harsh winter she's survived. She tells you about the Black Death, how it swept through the glens in 1350 like God's own house cleaning, taking 1 in 3 souls. Her grandmother survived by hiding in a cave for 6 months, living on dried fish and rainwater, only to emerge and find her entire village empty except for the crows. The mainstream history books mention the death toll. What they don't mention is how survivors would sometimes find entire families sitting at their tables, bowls still full, having died so quickly they didn't have time to finish dinner. She also shares the secret of Scottish women's survival while men are off playing with swords and stealing each other's cattle. Women run everything that actually matters. They manage the food stores, negotiate marriages like international treaties, and maintain the complex network of alliances and grudges that really determines who lives and who mysteriously falls off a cliff. One quirky historical detail: Highland women often hid the family valuables in their hair, creating elaborate hairstyles that were part fashion statement, part mobile banking. The party continues late into the night with whiskey flowing like water, mainly because the water isn't safe to drink. You watch men who were trying to kill each other this morning, now singing together about their mutual hatred of the English, because nothing unites Scots like a common enemy. Someone starts a dance that involves a suspicious amount of sword-waving for a social activity, and you decline to participate after calculating the statistical probability of accidental impalement. You retire to your corner of straw, slightly drunk and very confused about Highland social dynamics. As you drift off to sleep, you hear two men arguing about whether the earth is flat or shaped like a dinner plate, while a third insists it's obviously balanced on the back of a great cosmic haggis. The scholarly debate rages on, punctuated by creative profanity that would make a modern sailor blush. Historians still argue whether medieval scholarship was hindered more by lack of books or by conducting debates while catastrophically drunk. You're awakened before dawn by what sounds like someone strangling a goose, but turns out to be a piper practicing. In medieval Scotland, bagpipes serve multiple functions: musical instrument, psychological warfare, and reliable way to ensure no one oversleeps. The sound penetrates your skull like a rusty nail made of noise, and you understand why Highland armies were so fierce after living with this. Battle must have seemed peaceful. Today you're visiting the local monastery, because even in this violent landscape, religion maintains its iron grip on daily life. The Catholic Church in medieval Scotland is like Amazon Prime everywhere, controlling everything and taking a cut of all transactions. The difference is that canceling your subscription results in excommunication and possible burning, rather than just losing free shipping. The monastery sits on a small island in a loch, accessible only by boat when the monks feel like visitors, or by swimming when they don't. The brothers claim this isolation brings them closer to God, though you suspect it's really about being harder to raid. As your small boat approaches, you notice the monastery walls are suspiciously well fortified for men of peace, complete with arrow slits that would make excellent spots for contemplating divine mercy while shooting Vikings. The abbot greets you with the kind of smile that says, "Welcome, sinner," in 12 languages. He's a political operator disguised as a holy man, which in medieval Scotland is like being a shark disguised as a slightly different shark. He shows you around, pointing out the scriptorium where monks copy manuscripts when they're not brewing ale, tending crops, or collecting taxes with menacing efficiency. The monastery's prized possession is the illuminated Bible that took 40 years to create and is worth more than most Highland clans' entire assets. The margins are decorated with creatures that definitely aren't in Genesis, including what appears to be a rabbit playing bagpipes to a congregation of snails. When you ask about this, the monk explains it represents the diversity of God's creation, though you suspect it really represents 40 years of boredom and access to fermented grain. During prayers, you notice the fascinating blend of Christianity and older beliefs. The monks pray to saints who sound suspiciously like Celtic gods, with Christian names slapped on them. Saint Brigid protects cattle, how convenient. Saint Columba wards off evil, previously the fairy's job. And Saint Andrew helps with fishing, though not as effectively as the old river spirits, according to local whispers. Historians still debate whether this syncretism was theological evolution or just medieval rebranding, though anyone who's seen a new and improved product knows the answer. The monastery's dinner makes clan feasts look like decadent orgies. The monks eat in silence while one brother reads from scripture, choosing passages about suffering with what seems like deliberate irony. The meal is bread that could double as building material and pottage, that might contain vegetables if you define vegetable broadly enough to include moss and disappointment. The ale, however, is excellent, because even monks have priorities. After dinner, the abbot takes you aside for a theological discussion that's really a shakedown with Latin quotes. He explains how your clan chief owes tithes, how those tithes are sadly behind, and how unfortunate it would be if the chief found himself excommunicated right before the harvest blessing. The mainstream historical fact is that the medieval church was the largest landowner in Scotland. The quirky detail: some monasteries ran protection rackets that would make the mafia jealous, offering spiritual insurance against raids in exchange for regular payments. You're then treated to the monastery's secondary function education, though education here means learning just enough Latin to be terrified of hell. The novices are boys ranging from genuinely devout to those whose families had too many sons and needed somewhere to park the extras. They're learning to read using texts that alternate between mind-numbing theology and surprisingly graphic martyrdom stories. Because nothing says God is love like detailed descriptions of saints being flayed alive. One young monk shows you his secret project, a chronicle of Scottish history that includes events the church would prefer forgotten. There's the time a bishop's mistress gave birth during Mass, the year 3 rival popes all excommunicated each other simultaneously, and the persistent rumor that Saint Columba's relic isn't his finger bone, but actually a very old parsnip. He hides these additions in margins, disguised as decorative flourishes, creating a kind of medieval WikiLeaks in illuminated manuscript form. That night, you attend Compline, the final prayer service, where exhausted monks chant in Latin while trying not to fall asleep. The candlelight creates dancing shadows that make the stone saints seem to move, which might be divine presence or might be the mushrooms the cook definitely didn't add to the pottage. The service is hauntingly beautiful, despite or perhaps because of its setting in this fortress of faith, surrounded by violent chaos. As you prepare to leave the next morning, the abbot gifts you a small wooden cross for protection, though the suggested donation makes it clear this protection has a price point. You accept graciously, while mentally calculating how many cattle raids will be needed to cover the cost. The monks wave goodbye with the serenity of people who know they'll get their money one way or another, in this life or the next, preferably with interest. Your journey back to clan territory takes you through what the locals call debatable land, which is a polite way of saying area where you're likely to be murdered by anyone from 3 different clans. The morning mist clings to the heather like a shroud, which seems appropriate given the mortality rate for travelers in these parts. Your guide, a grizzled veteran missing various non-essential body parts, points out landmarks. That's where the MacLeods ambushed the Sinclairs in '89. That oak is where we hanged those MacLeod survivors. And that pile of rocks marks where the Sinclairs came back and killed everyone involved. Scottish GPS is basically a tour of historical violence. You pass a burned village, abandoned these 20 years since the last English raid. The stone walls stand like broken teeth against the sky, and weeds grow through what were once homes. Your guide spits and mutters something in Gaelic that probably doesn't translate to "those delightful English neighbors." The mainstream history tells of Edward Longshanks's brutal campaign. What it doesn't mention is how some Scottish villages developed elaborate warning systems using trained ravens, which worked great until the English started bringing hawks. The Scottish-English dynamic in this period is like a relationship between a violent drunk and a slightly more organized, violent drunk who happens to have better weapons. England keeps insisting Scotland should be grateful for the opportunity to be conquered, while Scotland responds with the medieval equivalent of, "Come at me, bro," despite being outnumbered, outgunned, and occasionally outkinged when their monarchs keep dying at inopportune moments. Stopping for the midday meal, you discover that Scottish trail food hasn't improved since breakfast. It's oatcakes and dried meat that might be beef, might be deer, might be leather that gave up. Your guide produces a flask of whiskey that could strip paint if paint had been invented yet, declaring it good for the health, which is technically true in that it kills most parasites and some brain cells you weren't using anyway. As you eat, he tells you about William Wallace, who's currently somewhere between folk hero and terrorist, depending on which side of the border you're on. The stories are already growing in the telling in some versions. Wallace is 7 feet tall and shoots fireballs from his eyes. Historians still debate Wallace's actual height, though everyone agrees he was tall enough to really annoy the English, which in medieval times was grounds for execution. The afternoon brings your first encounter with the famous Scottish weather in its full glory. The rain doesn't fall so much as attack from all angles simultaneously, including some that defy physics. Your plaid, which seemed like a clever garment choice this morning, now weighs approximately as much as a small pony and smells worse. You're beginning to understand why Scots developed such a robust culture of indoor drinking. By evening, you reach a small settlement, clinging to a hillside like a barnacle made of stone and stubbornness. The inhabitants eye you with the friendly warmth of people calculating whether you're worth robbing. Your guide vouches for you, which apparently means he's with me, so I get first dibs on his belongings if he dies. Highland hospitality. It's conditional, but it's something. The village headman offers you shelter in exchange for news, because in medieval Scotland, information is the only currency more valuable than cattle and significantly harder to steal. You share tales from the monastery, carefully editing out any criticism of the church, because these people may be poor, but they're not stupid enough to harbor heretics. They nod knowingly at descriptions of the abbot's wealth, having paid enough tithes to fund his golden candlesticks. Dinner is a communal affair, where communal means everyone brings what they can spare and hopes it adds up to a meal. The resulting stew contains identifiable turnips, theoretical meat, and something green that everyone agrees to call cabbage. It's served with the pride of people who know that tomorrow there might not be turnips. The quirky historical detail, medieval Scots developed dozens of euphemisms for starvation, turning linguistic creativity into a coping mechanism. The village storyteller, a woman old enough to remember when the English were merely annoying rather than actively genocidal, takes center stage. She tells of the sight, the Highland gift of prophecy that lets certain people see the future, usually involving someone's death, because Scottish prophecies are remarkably consistent in their pessimism. She claims her grandmother foresaw the plague, though admittedly, lots of people will die horribly. Wasn't exactly a tough prediction in medieval times. Children gather round as she shifts to lighter fairy tales of Selkies, who shed their seal skins to become human, of fairy hills, where a night's dancing lasts 100 years, of Kelpies, who drown travelers unless you know their true name. You notice the adults listening just as intently, and when a dog howls outside, everyone makes subtle warding gestures. Historians still argue whether medieval Scots genuinely believed in the supernatural or just found it a convenient explanation for a world that seemed actively trying to kill them. The stories continue late into the night, weaving together history and myth until you can't tell where one ends and the other begins. There's the tale of the clan chief who made a deal with the devil for victory in battle, only to discover the devil's definition of victory included, everyone you love dies horribly. But hey, you technically won. Scottish folklore teaching moral lessons through catastrophic examples since time immemorial. You're given the guest bed, which is a pile of heather in the corner, farthest from the leaking roof. It's an upgrade from last night's accommodation in that the livestock sharing your space seem less aggressive. As you settle in, you reflect on how medieval Scottish hospitality operates, on a complex system of obligation, reputation, and the implicit threat that if you mistreat a guest, their clan will turn your settlement into a cautionary tale. Sleep comes fitfully, interrupted by various creatures investigating whether you're edible and the sound of your host family's synchronous snoring, which achieves harmonies that would make a choir weep with envy. You dream of warm beds and food that doesn't require a survival instinct to digest. Then wake to find a chicken roosting on your chest, regarding you with the casual disdain of poultry everywhere. Morning arrives with all the subtlety of a clan raid. The entire household is up before the sun, because medieval Scotland operates on the principle that if you're comfortable, you're not working hard enough. Breakfast is porridge that could patch castle walls, served with the grim determination of people who know lunch is a bourgeois concept that won't be invented for centuries. You help with morning chores, discovering that medieval farming is basically a war against the earth, where the earth is winning. The soil seems personally offended by the concept of cultivation, yielding crops only under extreme duress and constant negotiation. The plow is a torture device for both operator and land, pulled by oxen who've clearly given up on life, but continue through sheer habit. The women's work is somehow even harder, involving a spinning wheel that seems designed by someone who hated both efficiency and human happiness. They transform rough wool into thread through a process that requires the patience of saints and the hand strength of arm wrestlers. One woman shows you her calluses with the pride of a warrior displaying battle scars, which, in economic terms, they basically are. Midday brings news that would have been breaking if news could break any faster than a horse can run. The English are stirring again, massing troops at the border with the subtle diplomatic grace of a brick through a window. The village headman calls a meeting where everyone pretends to debate whether to flee or fight, though everyone knows the decision was made the moment they were born. Scottish, they'll fight until fighting becomes obviously suicidal. Then, they'll flee to fight another day. The meeting reveals the complex political web of medieval Scotland, where loyalty is a multi-layered concept involving clan, king, and whoever isn't currently trying to kill you. The headman owes allegiance to the local laird, who owes allegiance to a greater lord, who theoretically owes allegiance to the king, who may or may not exist depending on whether the English have murdered him recently. It's feudalism, but with more stabbing and significantly worse communication. One man suggests seeking help from the Lord of the Isles, that semi-independent Gaelic prince who rules the Hebrides like a pirate king with better PR. Others argue this would be trading one master for another, though at least the Lord of the Isles speaks their language and shares their enemies. The debate continues with the passionate intensity of people who know their decision could mean survival or annihilation, seasoned with creative profanity that would make a modern Scottish football fan proud. You learn that these debates serve multiple purposes: actual decision-making, communal therapy, and entertainment in a world notably lacking in Netflix. Everyone gets to speak, from the ancient crone, who remembers 6 previous English invasions, to the teenage boy who just wants to hit someone with an axe. Democracy, Highland style, messy, loud, and occasionally punctuated by thrown objects. The discussion reveals fascinating details about Highland military organization, or lack thereof. There's no standing army, just farmers who own swords and a disturbing enthusiasm for using them. Military strategy consists mainly of charge screaming at the enemy, with occasional variations like charge screaming at the enemy from behind a hill. Historians still debate whether Highland battle tactics were primitive or secretly brilliant psychological warfare. Having seen these people prepare for battle, you're leaning toward both. Eventually, they decide to send word to the laird and prepare for either battle or strategic relocation, which is Highland for running away while stealing everything not nailed down. The women immediately begin hiding valuables in places the English won't think to look, which after centuries of practice include some genuinely creative locations. One woman is sewing coins into her children's clothes, while another buries the family's iron pot like pirate treasure. The afternoon is spent in martial preparation that would be impressive if it weren't so desperate. Men sharpen weapons that haven't seen maintenance since the last crisis. Oil leather that's more patch than original material. And practice battle cries that sound like someone stepping on a cat factory. You're handed a dirk and shown the basics of not stabbing yourself, which apparently is lesson 1 in Highland warfare curriculum. As night falls, the village transforms from a farming community into something resembling a military camp, designed by people who've heard of military camps but never seen one. Sentries are posted, though their main qualification seems to be owns a torch and can stay awake after drinking. Passwords are established, then immediately forgotten, leading to several near stabbings of villagers trying to relieve themselves in the dark. You're assigned to the night watch with a man named Dougal, who's missing an ear and several teeth, but makes up for it with an encyclopedic knowledge of every way the English have tried to kill him over the past 40 years. He regales you with stories while scanning the darkness for threats, somehow managing to make near-death experiences sound boring through sheer repetition. The night is filled with sounds that could be enemy approach, or could be Scotland's wildlife being its usual terrifying self. Every crack of a twig sends hands to weapons. Every owl hoot could be a signal. Dougal teaches you the fine art of paranoid vigilance, which involves assuming everything wants to kill you, because in medieval Scotland, it probably does. The mainstream historical fact is that constant warfare created a culture of perpetual alertness. The quirky detail: some clans trained dogs to recognize English accents, though this backfired when Scottish accents started diversifying. Around midnight, you witness something that would be beautiful if it weren't so ominous: fire beacons lighting up on distant hills, a chain of flame carrying the warning across the Highlands faster than any rider could travel. It's an ancient system that predates the Romans, though the message is depressingly modern. The English are coming. Prepare to die or run. Preferably run. The village erupts into controlled chaos as the beacon's message arrives. Families gather their possessions with the efficiency of people who've done this before. We'll do it again, and have accepted evacuation as a seasonal activity like harvest or lambing. Children are woken and dressed. Livestock are rounded up, and anything too heavy to carry is hidden or destroyed to deny it to the enemy. You help an elderly woman bury her cooking pot, her third, this decade. She mentions casually while she shares her philosophy on survival. The English can take our homes, our crops, even our lives, but they'll never take our ability to be absolutely furious about it. This seems to summarize the Scottish approach to foreign invasion, grudging acceptance combined with eternal, burning resentment. The evacuation proceeds with surprising efficiency, considering it's being conducted by people who can't agree on whether the earth is flat. Families move into the hills, following paths invisible to outsiders, but worn deep by generations of strategic retreats. The very old and very young ride the few available horses while everyone else walks, carrying possessions that represent the heartbreaking calculation of what's worth saving when you can only save so much. You notice the gendered division of evacuation. Labor men drive the cattle and prepare to fight the rearguard action. Women carry the children and food supplies, and everyone pretends this is a reasonable division, despite women doing significantly more actual work. One woman carries a baby, leads a toddler, and somehow manages a bundle containing the family's entire portable wealth, while her husband carries a sword and a sense of martial importance. The procession moves through the pre-dawn darkness with remarkable quiet, even the children understanding that noise means death. The only sounds are soft Gaelic whispers, the shuffle of feet on wet ground, and the occasional moo from a cow who didn't get the memo about operational security. Above, the stars wheel in their courses, utterly indifferent to the human drama below, which seems appropriate for Scottish history in general. By dawn, you've reached a temporary camp in a hidden glen that's clearly been used for this purpose since time immemorial. Crude shelters appear as if by magic, constructed from materials that were definitely not stolen from various abandoned villages over the years. The speed of setup suggests this isn't a refugee camp so much as a regularly scheduled life event. The camp operates on communal principles that would make a modern socialist weep with envy. Resources are pooled, work is shared, and anyone caught hoarding gets the kind of social shaming that makes death seem pleasant. It's a system born of necessity, where survival trumps property rights, and the only law is don't be the reason everyone else dies. Children adapt with the resilience of those who've never known true safety, turning the evacuation into an adventure involving stolen sheep and English soldiers as the villains. Their games involve surprisingly accurate recreations of battle tactics, suggesting that Highland military education starts at the barely walking stage. One quirky historical detail: refugee camps developed their own temporary economies, where skills became currency. A good storyteller could trade tales for food, and anyone who could make the waiting bearable was worth their weight in oats. You spend the day helping to establish defenses, which mostly involves piling rocks in strategic locations and arguing about what constitutes strategic. The debate between high ground advantage and easy escape routes continues for hours with the passion of people who have nothing but time and very strong opinions about not dying. Eventually, they compromise on a defense that provides neither advantage particularly well, but makes everyone feel included in the decision to die horribly. News arrives via a messenger who looks like he's been riding since the invention of horses. The English force is smaller than feared, but still large enough to ruin everyone's day. Led by a lord whose name translates roughly to Murderer of Scots, which shows a refreshing honesty in medieval nobility branding. The local laird is gathering the clan fighters, which means every male between can hold a sword and not actively dead is expected to show up. The women immediately begin preparing for the aftermath of battle, with the grim practicality of people who know someone's going to need burying. They tear cloth for bandages, prepare poultices from herbs that might help or might just make wounds smell better while you die, and sharpen the knives they'll need for either victory feast or mercy killings. Medieval Scottish healthcare, where the cure is often worse than the disease, but at least it's quick. That evening brings a war council that would be more impressive if it weren't held in a sheep pen and attended by men whose military experience ranges from fought the MacDonalds once to I own an axe. The Laird, a man who inherited his position through the careful strategy of not dying when his father did, lays out a battle plan that essentially boils down to hit them very hard and hope for the best. The discussion of tactics reveals the fascinating dichotomy of Highland warfare. These men can track a deer through a storm, navigate by stars, and survive on nothing but spite and heather. But ask them to form a coherent battle line, and you get chaos. Their strength lies not in discipline, but in the kind of ferocious independence that makes every warrior a one-man army with very strong opinions about following orders. You're drafted into the battle preparation despite your protests that you're more of a moral support kind of warrior. They hand you a leather jack that's seen better centuries and a helmet that's essentially a metal bowl with delusions of grandeur. The armor-fitting process involves a lot of "it'll do," and the blood will help it stick better, which isn't as reassuring as they seem to think. The night before, battle brings a celebration that seems counterintuitive until you realize it might be everyone's last chance to celebrate anything. The whiskey flows freely because facing death, sober is for lowlanders and Englishmen. Men who were discussing brutal death an hour ago now sing songs about brutal death from previous generations, turning ancestor trauma into drinking games. The entertainment includes a competition of martial prowess that's essentially organized, showing off with weapons. Men throw axes at targets, miss spectacularly, and blame the wind despite being indoors. The Highland Games, you realize, started as military training that got competitive because Scots can't do anything without keeping score. Someone suggests an arm wrestling tournament, which ends predictably with 2 dislocated shoulders and a broken table that was probably important to someone. Women join the celebration with the kind of determined festivity that says, we're having fun despite the circumstances, not because of them. They dance with men who might be corpses tomorrow, sing songs about men who became corpses yesterday, and maintain the social fabric that keeps the clan from dissolving into nihilistic despair. One woman teaches you a dance that involves more jumping than seems necessary, possibly designed to prepare participants for dodging arrows. The bard performs the genealogies of the major families, a performance that takes 3 hours and includes enough big-ats to make the Bible jealous. This isn't just entertainment, it's living history, legal documentation, and social networking all rolled into one interminable song. Historians still debate whether Highland genealogies were accurate or whether bards just made up connections to please patrons. Though in a culture where belief creates reality, the distinction hardly matters. As midnight approaches, the celebration takes on a more somber tone. Men make their peace with God through a priest who's definitely drunk, but manages to slur the Latin in a way that sounds official. Confessions are heard, though given the public nature and volume. Heard extends to everyone within shouting distance. The catalogue of sins suggests that medieval Highland life was either remarkably exciting, or people got creative with their transgression descriptions. You're pulled aside by the veteran who's been teaching you to fight, and he shares his warrior's wisdom. When the battle starts, stay near me. When I run, run faster. It's the kind of practical advice that military academies would frown upon, but has kept him alive through 20 years of people trying very hard to change that. He also teaches you the Highland Warrior's Prayer, which is surprisingly short and basically amounts to, "Please let me take some of them with me." Dawn comes like an unwelcome relative, too early and bringing problems. The camp transforms from hungover chaos to organized chaos as men prepare for battle with the efficiency of people who've accepted that efficiency is relative. Weapons are given final sharpening. Armor is adjusted to be slightly less uncomfortable. And last prayers are muttered to any deity who might be listening and taking requests. The march to battle is less glorious than stories suggest, mainly involving wet feet, heavy equipment, and the gradual realization that heroic death in battle still involves the death part. The Highland Army, such as it is, consists of farmers with swords, shepherds with axes, and fishermen with an unclear understanding of land-based combat. What they lack in training, they make up for in enthusiasm and an almost cheerful fatalism. You reach the chosen battlefield, a stretch of moor that's tactically significant, mainly because it's where both armies happen to meet. The English are already there, looking depressingly professional with their matching equipment and apparent knowledge of which end of the sword goes into the enemy. Your side responds by bunching together and trying to look numerous, which works about as well as expected. The pre-battle negotiations are a masterclass in medieval diplomacy. The English lord demands surrender, promises mercy he definitely won't deliver, and insults everyone's mothers in Latin to show he's educated. The Highland laird responds with creative anatomy lessons in Gaelic and suggestions about what the English lord can do with his terms that would require significant flexibility and a disregard for physics. Battle speeches happen because apparently no one can die without first hearing about glory and honor from someone who will be watching from a safe distance. The laird's speech is actually quite moving until you realize it's the same one his father gave, before losing spectacularly to different English invaders. The recycling of inspiration suggests either tradition or a lack of creativity under pressure. The actual battle begins with the Highland Charge, that famous screaming rush that historians describe as tactically questionable but psychologically effective. You find yourself running with the others, partly from courage, but mostly because standing still while everyone else charges seems like a good way to be trampled by your own side. The battle cry you attempt comes out as more of a terrified squeak, but in the general cacophony, no one notices. Combat, you discover, is nothing like the songs describe, unless those songs include verses about terror, confusion, and the sudden urgent need to not die. Your careful sword training disappears in the face of an Englishman who seems personally offended by your existence. The fight devolves into desperate flailing that would embarrass a drunk tavern brawl, but somehow keeps you alive through pure unpredictability. The battle flows around you in waves of violence and chaos. You see acts of incredible bravery, usually followed immediately by death, and acts of prudent cowardice, usually followed by survival. The English formation holds against the Highland Charge because discipline beats enthusiasm in most contests that don't involve drinking. But the Scots refuse to accept defeat, possibly because they're too stubborn to realize they're losing. A turning point comes when someone histories disagree who, though 17 clans claim credit, manages to flank the English position. What follows is the kind of brutal close combat that makes everyone involved reconsider their life choices. You find yourself in a shield wall, which is like being in a very violent group hug where everyone's trying to stab everyone else. The man next to you is praying loudly in Gaelic, though whether for victory or quick death is unclear. The English begin to retreat, which in medieval warfare means organized withdrawal, but looks suspiciously like running away while maintaining formation. The Scots pursue with the enthusiasm of people who rarely get to be on the winning side, turning retreat into rout. You join the pursuit mainly because standing still on a battlefield full of armed, excited Highlanders seems inadvisable. Victory, when it comes, is less glorious than exhausting. The field is littered with the detritus of battle-broken weapons, broken armor, broken men. The aftermath involves the kind of practical brutality that songs skip over finishing the wounded, stripping the dead, arguing over loot distribution. You help with the grim work, while trying not to think too hard about the morning's philosophical discussions on the nature of glory. The journey back to camp is subdued despite victory. Too many faces are missing. Too many wounds need tending. The women meet the returning warriors with a mixture of relief and grief, quickly sorting the living from the dying from the dead. Medical treatment consists mainly of whiskey, external and internal application, rough stitching, and hope. Survival rates suggest hope might be the most effective component. The victory celebration is muted by exhaustion and loss. The feast features captured English supplies, which ironically provide better eating than the clan has seen in months. There's something surreal about toasting your enemy's death with his wine. But medieval ethics are flexible about post-battle etiquette. The main rule seems to be the dead don't need provisions, which is hard to argue with. Stories of the battle are already evolving, with each retelling adding heroic details that survivors don't remember, but don't dispute. Your own terrified stumbling has become a berserker rage that struck fear into English hearts, which would be flattering if it weren't so obviously fictional. But you're learning that Highland history is collaborative fiction, where everyone agrees to believe the version that makes the clan look best. The bard composes a new song about the battle that bears minimal resemblance to actual events, but captures the emotional truth of victory against odds. He turns farmers into heroes, transforms desperate defense into cunning strategy, and somehow makes dysentery sound noble when suffered for the clan. It's propaganda, but it's beautiful propaganda that will inspire the next generation to similar acts of foolish bravery. That night brings the kind of deep sleep that only comes from exhaustion and survival. You dream of home, wherever that is now, and wake to find that life continues with startling normalcy. Cows need milking, fields need tending, and the English will definitely be back with more soldiers and worse attitudes. The cycle continues because in medieval Scotland, peace is just the pause between violent interruptions. The next few days blend into routine, punctuated by funeral rites. Scottish funerals are surprisingly cheerful affairs, involving aggressive drinking and competitive grief. Mourners share stories of the deceased that become increasingly improbable as the whiskey flows. By evening, every dead warrior was apparently the greatest fighter who ever lived, which raises questions about how they died, but no one's sober enough to ask. You help with the practical aftermath of victory, treating wounds that are starting to fester, building cairns for the dead, and explaining to children why their fathers aren't coming back. The children accept this with the matter-of-fact fatalism of those raised in perpetual warfare. One boy of maybe 8 solemnly informs you he'll kill many English when he's grown, with the casual certainty of someone discussing career plans. As your time in medieval Scotland draws toward its close, you're invited to witness a hand-fasting ceremony. Highland marriages are practical affairs designed to cement alliances and produce warriors, with love as an optional extra that sometimes develops if you're lucky. This particular union involves a Campbell daughter and a MacLeod son, which everyone agrees is either a brilliant peace initiative or a disaster waiting to happen. The ceremony blends Christian ritual with older traditions that the church pretends not to notice. The couple's hands are bound while they make vows that essentially amount to, "I promise not to murder you or your family unless really necessary." The priest performs the Christian ceremony while carefully not watching the pagan elements happening in his peripheral vision. It's religious compromise, Highland style. Everyone's slightly unhappy, but no one's burning anyone. The wedding feast makes previous celebrations look austere. Somehow, in this land of perpetual scarcity, they've produced enough food and alcohol to feed an army, which is convenient since that's essentially what a clan gathering is. The bride's family and groom's family sit on opposite sides, eyeing each other with the wary courtesy of people who were killing each other last year and might resume next week. Entertainment includes the traditional humiliation of the groom, which involves tests of strength, courage, and alcohol tolerance that would violate several Geneva Conventions if those existed yet. He's required to compose poetry praising his bride's beauty, while increasingly drunk. Men throw things at him. He manages admirably, though his comparison of her eyes to two pools of water, the wet kind, suggests the alcohol is winning. The bride, meanwhile, endures her own trials involving pointed questions about children, household management, and her ability to hide valuables from both her husband and potential raiders. She passes by demonstrating knowledge of 15 different uses for an iron pot, including braining intruders, which gets approving nods from the matrons. Highland marriage preparation, where domestic skills include light combat training. As night falls, the celebration reaches peak chaos. Someone starts a dance that devolves into a brawl, that evolves into a different dance. Musical instruments appear from nowhere, all playing different songs simultaneously in a cacophony that somehow works. You're dragged into a reel that seems designed to cause joint dislocation, partnered with a woman who explains the steps by simply spinning you violently whenever you do something wrong. Your final morning in medieval Scotland arrives with the same lack of ceremony as all the others. Rain, porridge, and people already working before full daylight. The clan prepares to move back to their original settlement now that this particular English threat has passed. Everything is packed with the efficiency of people who've spent more time moving than staying, which in Scottish history is saying something. The goodbyes are brusque, but warm. Highland emotion expressed mainly through violent backslapping and gruff nods. The woman who taught you to dance gives you a charm against evil, which is a rock with a hole in it, but comes with such sincere conviction that you'd wear it into battle. The veteran who kept you alive gifts you his spare dirk with the advice to stick them with the pointy end, which is both obvious and somehow profound. You take one last look at these impossible people who've survived impossible circumstances through sheer bloody-mindedness and whiskey. They're preparing for the next crisis with the same fatalistic cheer that's carried them through centuries of crises. Someone's already arguing about the quickest route home. Someone else is stealing cattle for the journey. and life continues in all its violent, difficult, beautiful complexity. The bard, because of course there's always a bard, composes a farewell song that makes your brief stay sound like an epic worthy of ancient heroes. In his version, you brought wisdom from distant lands and stood shoulder to shoulder with Highland warriors against overwhelming odds. The fact that you mostly brought confusion and stood wherever seemed safest is diplomatically forgotten. But that's Highland hospitality. They make you feel like you belong, even when you clearly don't. As you walk away through the morning mist, the sounds of clan life fade, but never quite disappear. The bagpipes' lament follows you over the hills, a sound that will haunt your dreams, along with the taste of proper porridge and the memory of people who faced death with the same attitude they faced breakfast grimly, together, and with significant amounts of alcohol. You realize that medieval Scotland wasn't just a place or time, but a state of mind, one where survival meant community, where violence and beauty existed in constant tension, and where people found joy in the teeth of hardship that would break softer souls. They were people who turned suffering into strength, who made poetry from pain, and who faced each day knowing it might be their last, but living it fully anyway. The mist thickens as you walk, Scotland slowly reclaiming you for the present. But you carry with you the knowledge of what life was truly like in those brutal centuries. Not the Hollywood version of noble warriors and misty romance, but the reality of mud and blood, of courage born from necessity, of communities bound by shared suffering and stubborn hope. As your footsteps fade into the Highland mist, the past releases its grip gently. You've walked with warriors and farmers, witnessed battles and weddings, shared their struggles and their strength. The rain continues, soft and eternal, washing away the bloodstains of history, but never the memory. You're returning to your own time now, carrying with you the echoes of bagpipes and battle cries, of whispered prayers and whiskey-soaked songs. Medieval Scotland recedes like a dream, but one that's left its mark on your soul. The modern world awaits, but you'll never quite forget the taste of that porridge or the fierce light in Highland eyes. Rest now, weary time traveler. Let the ancient stones settle back into silence. Let the mists cover the battlefields once more. You're safe in your warm bed, far from clan feuds and English raids. But perhaps, in your dreams tonight, you'll hear the pipes calling you back to those terrible, beautiful days when life was brutal, death was close, and people lived with an intensity we can barely imagine. Sweet dreams, and may your sleep be more peaceful than any medieval Scot ever knew. End of script. Sweet dreams.